3:45 on the morning of Friday the 31st of August 1888. A Mr. Robert Paul walking to his work as a carman turned onto Box Row, now Durward Street, in Whitechapel, London, and encountered a man standing in the darkness where the lifeless or near lifeless body of Mary Ann Nichols lay, in front of the gate of Brown's stable yard. Something about this man's demeanour unnerved Robert Paul. This is certainly the sense we get from the interview he gave to a reporter for Lloyd's weekly newspaper on the evening of the murder, when he was returning back through Box Row on his way home. This man came a little towards him, and Paul, as he said, tried to give him a wide berth. These were dangerous streets. This was a dangerous area. Paul knew of the gangs which plagued the area, and he was aware that people had been knocked down and robbed there. While it may be something, and it may be nothing, we have to take Paul's first impression of this other man seriously. This is a murder scene. This man, however, pressed on and asked him to come and look at this woman. Mary Ann, known as Polly Nichols, a 43-year-old woman living in grinding poverty in London's East End, was the first of the canonical Whitechapel murders of a serial killer to whom the newspapers at the time gave the moniker Jack the Ripper. Yet whoever this man was, Polly was most certainly not his first victim. The details of her post-mortem examination paint a picture of an experienced and confident killer, where earlier murders, such as those of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, as potential Ripper crimes are a matter of speculation. What is clear from the investigation into the murder of Nichols is that this is an offender at the height and not the beginning of his homicidal career. The man Robert Paul discovered standing in the dark where the body of Mary Ann Nichols lay, a man he did not see or hear ahead of him until he arrived on Box Row, is, of all the 5 canonical murder scenes, the closest we get to the Ripper himself. These were not busy streets. Contrary to the myth that thousands used these streets, at 3:15 that morning, PC John Neal, whose beat covered Box Row, reported to the coroner's inquiry that he saw no one, and that half an hour later, when he discovered Nichols' body, there was not a soul about. From sunrise all through the day and well into the night, these streets were teeming with people. In late Victorian Britain, London was a bustling metropolis, and Whitechapel was home to no fewer than 30,000 people. But at 3:30 in the morning, when police constables like Jonas Misen were knocking people up for work, these streets were deserted. They were dark, narrow, and had an awful reputation for crime and violence. When PC Neal passed through Box Row at 3:15 in the morning, there was not a soul about, and as Robert Paul made his way to work, the streets were entirely empty. Neal saw no one. Paul saw just one person, the man standing where the body of Nichols lay. Now, guilty or not, this fact alone makes this man a person of interest to the investigation into the murder of Polly Nichols and the others. This man has to be eliminated from the inquiry before we can seriously consider anyone else as a suspect. In the first episode, Murder in Whitechapel, Charles Allen Cross, we discovered who this man was. Together with Robert Paul, he investigated the body of Nichols, determining that she was either dead or drunk. He and Paul walked on to Baker's Row at the end of Hanbury Street, whereat he informed PC Misen, who was on knock-up duty, that he was wanted by a policeman in Box Row, where a woman was lying. Furthermore, this man attended the inquest into the murder on the 3rd of September 1888 and gave evidence. On the face of it, these details suggest a perfectly innocent man who just so happened to discover the body of a murder victim on his way to work. This behaviour then gave the police no reason to take further note of him. In Cutting Point, solving the Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso murders 2021, Krister Holmgren, a friend of this channel, makes the interesting observation that this apparent helpfulness on the part of the witness did not conform to late 19th century English policing's model of a guilty man. This witness, who identified himself as Charles Allen Cross of 22 Doveton Street, walked from the inquest in the Working Lads Institute on the Whitechapel Road on Monday the 3rd of September 1888, never to be seen or heard from again. At most, for over a century, this man, Charles Cross, was nothing more than a footnote in the Ripper investigation. He was but a detail in a narrative popular Ripperology had constructed of the brutal murder of Mary Ann Nichols. One need only turn to the opening pages of Donald Rumbelow, the godfather of Ripperology's 1975 The Complete Jack the Ripper. Quote, "When Charles Cross walked through dark and empty Bucks Row on his way to work as a market porter at about 3:40 a.m. on the morning of Friday, 31st of August 1888, the only light was a solitary gas lamp at the far end. On one side of the street was a warehouse wall, and on the other some terraced houses, occupied for the most part by better-class tradesmen. He was opposite these houses when, in a gateway leading into some stables between the houses and the board school, he saw a bundle that he at first thought was a tarpaulin. It was only when he crossed over for a closer look that he realised that the bundle was in fact a woman. She was lying on her back with one hand nearly touching the stable gate and the other her black bonnet, which was lying close by. Her skirt was pushed up almost to her waist. His first thought was that she had been raped and was still unconscious from the attack, and the next that he might have disturbed her attacker. Normally, there was a great deal of noise in the street, but at that hour of the morning it was quiet, and although he listened carefully for any strange noises, he could hear none. If he had disturbed the woman's attacker, he must have heard his footsteps as he escaped, or supposing that the woman had been brought there in a cart and dumped, the rattle of wheels as they drove off. He was still by the body when he heard footsteps behind him. Any novice sleuth now, familiar as we all are with television shows like Law and Order and CSI and true crime documentaries, will recognise a number of elementary crime scene blunders in Rumbelow's account. First, it assumes the veracity of the witness account and the time frame. Given that the witness was, by his own admission, alone with the victim in the dark on an empty street, this is a potentially catastrophic error. Secondly, it is entirely uncritical of an account that has a number of rather obvious inconsistencies. Cross was running late for work, and yet he stopped in a dark and dangerous street in the wee hours to investigate what he thought was a discarded sheet of tarpaulin. He arrived there so close to what Dr. Llewellyn would describe to be the time of death, and yet heard no one running away or wheels spinning off. He continued to wait with the body, not investigating himself until another person arrived. Perhaps most problematic is that Rumbelow allows this witness to set the narrative. So much so, in fact, that he himself assists Charles Cross by speculating about him listening carefully for strange noises. The truth is that we know nothing about this. All that is known is that Charles Cross was alone on the street with the victim when Robert Paul arrived. In fact, as we saw in the last episode, when we look at the behaviour of this man on the night and at the inquest, we begin to see quite a suspicious character. He claimed to have left his home to walk to work at about 3:30 in the morning. Another newspaper account puts this at 3:20. It would have taken him no more than 7 minutes to reach Brown's stable yard gate on Bucks Row, Depending on the actual time he left his house, Cross would have arrived at the scene of the crime between 8 and 18 minutes before Robert Paul arrived. At the very least, he was standing by the body of the victim for almost 10 minutes, alone and in the dark. This, too, is highly suspicious. When Robert Paul arrived on Box Row, there was something about this other man that put him on edge. Paul's first impression and his natural intuition, as he had said, have to be taken seriously. This man was standing where the woman was. It was dark, and the man was alone. Robert Paul had neither seen nor heard him walking ahead of him. This other man, who identified himself at the inquest as Charles Allen Cross, had been at the scene, according to his own evidence, for at least 8 minutes, despite later telling Robert Paul that he was running behind time for work. It was Cross who approached Paul so as to recruit assistance in checking on the woman on the road, and Paul suspected from the slight stirring from her body that she might still be alive, a point which chimes with Dr. Llewellyn's estimation for the time of death, no more than half an hour before his 4 a.m. arrival on the scene for the examination. Both men pulled her clothes down over her legs in order to preserve her dignity, an action which in effect hid the terrible injuries to her abdominal area, and yet Cross refused to help Paul prop her up, an inaction which in effect hid the awful, almost decapitating slashes across her throat. Indeed, these details may be simple happenstance and a matter of coincidence, but as the coincidences continue to pile up, it cannot reasonably be denied that this is how one might predict a killer caught in the act to behave under such circumstances. Attacking Paul and or fleeing the scene would have certainly raised the alarm and would have likely resulted in his speedy apprehension. We know there were at least 3 police constables in the area. Anyone running in hobnail boots over the cobblestones at this time in the morning would have been easily followed. Playing the innocent and involving Paul in his cover was, under the circumstances, the smart thing to do. No, this suggestion does not make Charles Cross guilty, but it is a rational observation to make. Another interesting detail at the scene which Edward Stow highlights as a red flag in his video Jack the Ripper, The Evidence for Guilt Part 1 on his House of Lechmere YouTube channel is Charles Cross's comment that he at first thought the shape of the woman in front of the gate was a discarded tarpaulin. This seemingly innocuous detail has gone under the radar for over a century, but it really does deserve further scrutiny. Stow reminds us, besides this being an obvious example of distancing language, that this is exactly the species of superfluous detail investigators look for in modern criminal investigations. Moreover, it makes little sense why a man running late for work would stop in a dangerous area in the dark to scavenge a useful piece of rubbish. Pickford's depot at Broad Street, where he worked, had its own tarpaulin store, so this is a dubious reason he gives, to say the least. As we know from the evidence given to Win Edwin Baxter's inquest at the Working Lads Institute on Monday the 3rd of September 1888, the second day of the inquest, and the same day Charles Cross gave evidence, PC Jonas Misen was approached by a carman and told that he was wanted by a policeman in Box Row where a woman was lying. It was only one of the 2 carmen seen by Misen who approached him and said this, meaning it was out of the earshot of the other. Charles Cross and Robert Paul left Box Row together with the intention of informing the first policeman they saw about the woman they assumed was dead. Cross went over to Misen alone at the intersection of Hanbury Street and Baker's Row and told him another policeman wanted him and that a woman was lying on the road. but there was no other policeman on Box Row when Cross and Paul left. We can be sure, had he heard this statement, Robert Paul would have corrected it and become rather suspicious of the character of his new companion. These two untruths, that there was a policeman on Box Row looking for assistance with a woman merely lying on the road, stripped the incident of its urgency and they obviated any procedural requirement on the part of PC Misen to detain Cross and Paul for further questioning. The result of these lies was that Cross was free to continue on his way into the darkness. Why, we must ask, would an innocent passer-by, after finding the body of a murdered woman, lie to the police? But a more interesting question is this: why would a man guilty of murdering a woman, after having successfully evaded the police at the scene, present himself to give evidence at the inquest into her death? Many students of the Whitechapel murders of 1888 tend to follow the thinking of the police at the time. This man, Charles Cross, reported the incident to the police and he freely attended the inquest, so he must therefore be an innocent man who just so happened to discover the body of a murdered woman. This is a perfectly rational assumption, but it is just that, an assumption. Perhaps we ought to take a closer look at this assumption. We know he lied in his first report to PC Misen, and we know he lied to the coroner. Unlike Robert Paul, who gave an account of the discovery of Mary Ann Nichols' body to a reporter for Lloyd's Weekly, Charles Cross did not. Maybe he was a quiet and private man, sure. We know from very recent research that he never even told members of his own family that he had stumbled across the first canonical victim of London's most notorious serial killer. In the days following the murder, it would have been the talk of Whitechapel. Everyone would have been reading about it in the newspapers and discussing it over their bread and dripping at work. Yet even when it was reported the following day that it was PC John Neal who found the body, Charles Cross kept his silence, feeling no need to correct the record. From the Evening News on the 1st of September 1888. At 3:45 yesterday morning, Police Constable John Neal was on his beat in Box Row, Thomas Street, Whitechapel, when his attention was attracted to the body of a woman lying on the pavement close to the door of the stable yard in connection with Essex Wharf. Box Row, like many minor thoroughfares in this and similar neighbourhoods, is not overburdened with gas lamps, and in the dim light the constable at first thought that the woman had fallen down in a drunken stupor and was sleeping off the effects of a night's debauch. With the aid of the light from his bull's-eye lantern, Neal at once perceived that the woman had been the victim of some horrible outrage. Her livid face was stained with blood and her throat cut from ear to ear." End quote. It is simply not believable that Charles Cross, a carman who carted meat all over the East End of London, was not aware of this talk of murder. And aware of it, he did not present himself to the police or to the inquest. He told no one of his connection to the case. But we know he did eventually present himself to the inquest. He did this on the 3rd of September, the day after Lloyd's Weekly published a report under the heading, "Remarkable Statement." On Friday night, Mr. Robert Paul, a carman, on his return from work, made the following statement to our representative. He said, "It was exactly 3:45 when I passed up Box Row to my work. As a carman for Covent Garden Market, it was dark and I was hurrying along when I saw a man standing where the woman was. He came a little towards me, but as I knew the dangerous character of the locality, I tried to give him a wide berth. Few people like to come up and down here without being on their guard, for there are such terrible gangs about. There have been many knocked down and robbed at that spot. The man, however, came towards me and said, 'Come and look at this woman.' I went and found the woman lying on her back. I laid hold of her wrist and found that she was dead, and the hands cold. It was too dark to see the blood about her. Until then, 3 days after the murder, the narrative of the crime was that at 3:45 a.m. PC John Neal discovered the body of Mary Ann Nichols on Box Row. No one was interested in two carmen making their ways to work, and although Robert Paul had made this statement to the newspaper on the evening of Friday the 31st of August, it was not published until the following Sunday. Now, two carmen become a matter of interest to the inquiry. Had the carmen seen by Robert Paul been the killer, it was possible for him to ignore the report and stay out of the limelight, but this would not have worked. He had been seen by both Robert Paul and PC Misen. Charles Cross was local and had to make his way through those very streets to work and back. Paul was a neighbour who walked the same route, and Misen was the local bobby. There would have absolutely been a police manhunt for him as an important witness, and the longer he avoided detection, the more suspicion he would arise. Again, the smart thing for a guilty man to do in this situation would be to bite the bullet and attend the inquest. On Monday the 3rd of September, Charles Cross attended the inquest on the Whitechapel Road in his work attire, a detail that, perhaps coincidentally, would have not alerted his family to the fact he had a connection to the murder. He gave his name as Charles Allen Cross and his home address, which he appears to have mumbled, only one newspaper picked up on it, as 22 Doveton Street, Bethnal Green, and he flat out denied that he had told PC Misen, who recognised him and identified him at the inquest, that he was wanted by another policeman because, as he said, he did not see another policeman in Box Row. Charles Allen Cross walked from the first floor hall of the Working Lads Institute on the 3rd of September and vanished from the investigation. For well over a century he remained nothing more than a footnote, a name with but a tangential connection to the Whitechapel murders. Had it not been for Michael Connor's October 2006 article, Did the Ripper Work for Pickford's Ripperologist, issue 72, Charles Cross would have remained just that, a footnote. Considering the 2 times reported of Cross leaving for work on the morning of the murder, Connor notes, if Cross was lying and left Doveton Street at his normal time of 3:20, he had time to meet and kill Nichols. If he left at 3:30, he still had time for a blitz attack on Nichols before he was interrupted. This was, as we can see with perfect hindsight, a statement of the obvious. Of course, Charles Cross could have been the killer, and as he was the first on the scene, he had been alone with the victim for at least 8 minutes, more than enough time for a blitz attack. He should have been investigated more thoroughly by the police at the time. In a modern murder investigation, the inquiry could not progress until such a witness had been eliminated from the inquiry. It is Christer Holmgren who makes the astute observation that such an ordinary man, a man who, as Connor remarks, was exactly the sort of person anyone expected to find on the streets, did not fit the criminological profile the London police were working with in late Victorian England. Charles Cross was not a German, a Pole, a Russian Jew, or a flamboyantly dressed foreign eccentric. He was an ordinary working-class Englishman who showed up to an inquest and gave a sworn testimony. He was of no interest to the police, the public, or indeed the press. He was part of the fabric of Whitechapel. He was invisible. And we know he liked it that way. When Charles Cross was brought to the wider public's attention as a serious candidate suspect for the Ripper crimes, it was not long before other amateur sleuths went looking for the carman. At the end of the last episode, we too decided it was time to knock on the door of 22 Doveton Street, but in doing this, like every other investigation into Charles Cross, we are immediately confronted with something entirely shocking, something the revelation of which proves rather explosive in blowing open the mystery of Jack the Ripper. Till this point, much to the annoyance of many in the comment section of the last video, I have stuck to the name Charles Allen Cross, the name the carman gave at the inquest into Mary Ann Nichols' murder. But when we reach the door of 22 Doveton Street, we quickly discover that no such person exists. Charles Cross never existed, save for 3 brief moments in the official records. The shocking revelation is that the carman Charles Cross, the suspect identified by Michael Connor, left the Working Lads Institute and into historical obscurity after giving a false name. We find ourselves looking into the void that is the Kaiser Soze of the hunt for Saucy Jack. No one by the name of Cross lived at 22 Doveton Street. No one by that name ever lived at that address. But this discovery is not at all a dead end. Rather, what we find is something far more tantalising. In the 1891 census, conducted less than 3 years after the Whitechapel murders ended, we find a Charles Allen Lechmere, not Cross, Lechmere, living at this address. He is a 41-year-old carman born in Soho in London. He is living there with his wife Elizabeth, also 41, and 6 of their children. And he is undoubtedly the same man who presented himself with the alias Cross at the Nichols inquest in September 1888. Why would a man give a false name to the authorities in a murder inquiry? There are a few reasons why, and we will address those in due course, but this is a man who was discovered alone by the body of a murder victim in the dark, after having loitered there long enough to have perpetrated a blitz attack. Moreover, given what is now well known of the Ripper's MO, it is clear from the incomplete post-mortem assault on Nichols that the killer was interrupted. Charles Lechmere, calling himself Charles Allen Cross, gave no account in his testimony of hearing or seeing anyone run off as he approached, and about 30 yards away on Winthorpe Street, the night watchman Alfred Mulshaw heard nothing either. It starts to become an altogether convincing hypothesis to put to the jury that it was Charles Allen Lechmere who was interrupted by the approach of Robert Paul. Lechmere does nothing to remove suspicion from himself. He was the only person heard and seen at the crime scene within minutes of her murder, very possibly within seconds. Robert Paul, we recall, detected a slight movement as of breathing, but very faint, when he inspected the body, and blood had not yet started leaking from under her head. It is in this mess of a situation that Charles Lechmere told 2 significant lies to PC Misen, and then lied about lying at the inquest. He helped to cover the injuries on the victim's lower body and refused to take further assisting action which would expose the injuries to her neck. To top this off, he then gave a false name at the inquest, an inquest that very much looks like he felt compelled to attend if he was to avoid drawing the police's suspicions to himself. There has, of course, been a great deal of heated debate surrounding the Lechmere hypothesis, and it has rightly been pointed out by its detractors that many people used and still use aliases for perfectly legal and legitimate reasons. It has also been correctly pointed out that Charles Allen Lechmere was for a while as a child Charles Allen Cross. In 1858, Charles's mother, Maria Louisa, married a police constable by the name of Thomas Cross, and in the 1861 census, at the age of 11, Charles was listed, presumably by his stepfather as head of the household, as Charles Allen Cross. In the 1871 census, however, Charles, now 21 and married to Elizabeth and living at 11 Mary Ann Street, St George in the East, had retaken the name Lechmere, the family name taken by his wife and later by all of their children. In no other official document does Charles appear as Charles Cross. That is except for the Nichols inquest and very possibly another brush with the law. It is important to note here that he never listed himself as Cross in official or employment-related documents. This was done but once for him in April 1861 by a stepfather. He never used it again. Suggestions to the contrary are not based on the evidence. So here we might take a brief pause to consider the use of an alias when dealing with the police and the legal authorities. There is precedent for this in other more modern serial killer cases. Peter William Sutcliffe, when arrested in 1981, gave the name Peter Coonan before coming clean and giving a voluntary statement. What is interesting here is that the name Coonan was his mother's maiden name. Like Lechmere's use of Cross, this was a family-adjacent name. It is not at all uncommon for persons hoping to conceal their identity from the police to select pseudonyms or aliases connected but not immediately or directly to their own family. For one, it is easy for them to remember, and it is likely to hold some significance, positive or negative, to the user. As suspect as his behaviour and mendacity make him, Charles Allen Lechmere, as a Ripper suspect, has the exceptional privilege of also being the only named suspect in the case who can be placed at a Ripper crime scene at the time of the murder. It becomes absolutely necessary, assuming his innocence, as we should do until proven otherwise, to eliminate him from our inquiries, but this proves to be an extremely difficult thing to do. A rather pedestrian truth of criminal investigations of this scale is that the culprit invariably appears in the record. Charles Lechmere is standing right there in the contemporary records. The police and the inquest have seen and heard him, and yet he remains unidentified and beyond the scope of their suspicious gaze. Regardless of personal opinions, all have to agree at least on this. On a circumstantial basis, with a considerable weight of circumstantial evidence, might we add, it does not look good for Lechmere. The lies he told P.C. Misen allowed Robert Paul and himself to continue on down Hanbury Street to their places of employment unhindered. And this is where the coincidences really start to heap up in the case now being built against him. The following weekend, in the early hours of Saturday the 8th of September 1888, the second canonical victim of the Ripper, Annie Chapman, was brutally murdered and eviscerated in the dark and dingy backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, the beginning of a pattern which starts to draw the picture of a commuter killer. From the evidence thus far, it can be seen that Lechmere's route to work took him directly past two Ripper murder sites, that of Mary and Nichols on Bucks Row and that of Annie Chapman at 29 Hanbury Street, and at about the time the murders were being committed, at a time when the streets were otherwise deserted. This is quite a coincidence. Hypothetically assuming he is the killer then, what we may construct from his east-west movement through Whitechapel from Doveton Street to the Broad Street Depot is a criminal modus via, of which there are two basic models. In a 1996 paper, criminologist David Carter proposed the marauder-commuter hypotheses of serial criminal behaviour, in which the offender has a home range where he lives and a criminal range where he offends. According to this now widely accepted theory, the marauder's home range is within his criminal range, and so we will see offences committed in a radial pattern around where he lives. This marauder theory lends itself particularly well to the geographic profiling such as we have already seen in recent Ripper investigations. However, the commuter hypothesis then proposes that there is little or no overlap between these two areas, and that the offender moves to a district which is outside his home range to offend. This is not to suggest that the criminal range is unfamiliar to the offender, but that it is at an appreciable distance from the area in which he habitually operates as a non-offender. Charles Lechmere, supposing for a moment he is the killer, is moving from his home range, Doveton Street, to his criminal range, an area of Whitechapel north of the Whitechapel High Street and around Commercial Street, an area known for street prostitution, a red light area. This is his criminal range because it is a place where he knows he can find a ready supply of vulnerable women prepared to place themselves due to their economic desperation into dangerous situations. Some will attempt to dismiss this, no doubt, with the valid assertion that he was simply on his way to work. Yes, this may be so, but we have ample evidence of commuter serial killers who incorporated their work routines and their offending patterns. Peter Sutcliffe and Robert Black are two such examples in the United Kingdom alone. Lechmere passing through his criminal range en route to work would leave an evidential trail in the geographical distribution of the crimes. He is not aimlessly wandering around the streets looking for victims. He is walking to work and on the way coming upon his victims. Thus, when we draw a straight line on the map between his home in 22 Doveton Street and his place of work, the Pickford's Broad Street depot, we would expect to see something very much like a scatter chart, with crime scenes generally conforming to the line drawn. And this is precisely what we do find with 5 of the 7 murders associated with the Ripper case. 3 of the canonical murders, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman and Mary Jane Kelly, together with those of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram. Interestingly, rather than undermining this theory, the other 2 canonical murders, those of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the murders of the so-called double event, turn out to be the exception that proves the rule. These murders were committed in the early hours of Sunday, the 30th of September 1888, and, it being a Sunday, they were committed on his day off. Elizabeth Stride's body was found at about 1 a.m. by Louis Deamsheets, an employee of the International Working Men's Educational Club just inside the gateway of Dutfield Yard on Berner Street, a laneway leading to the Working Men's Club. It is often noted in the Ripper case literature that Berner Street is situated well to the south of the Ripper's stomping ground, the area it is assumed he is most familiar and comfortable, and too far south of the suggested psychological barrier of the Whitechapel Road. All of the other crimes are committed north of the Whitechapel Road and to either side of Commercial Street, the killer's criminal range. The Stride case, as the singular outlier to this norm, has allowed for others to propose a marauder model of the Ripper murders, generally targeting the American quack doctor Francis Tumblety, but this need not be the only way to interpret the data. Berner Street, now Henriques Street, is but an 11-minute walk from St George Street in St George in the East, where Charles Lechmere's mother, Mary Louisa, was living with her husband Joseph Forsdyke and one of Lechmere's daughters, the 13-year-old Mary Jane Lechmere. It is not only likely, it is probable that Charles Lechmere paid them a visit of a Saturday evening when he had the following day off work. Moreover, the walk from 18 St George Street to Berner Street fits the northward route Lechmere would have taken when making his way over the Whitechapel road towards his home on Doveton Street. It is entirely conceivable that after a day's work, Charles Lechmere returned home to freshen up before heading south of the Whitechapel road to pay his mother and daughter a visit. We do not need to speculate on the nature of his relationship with his mother, as others have. For the purposes of a criminal investigation, all we have to do is convincingly place a suspect at a scene, and this is it. In fact, it is frankly unbelievable that Charles Lechmere would have had no reason to go to 18 St George's Street, passing through Berners Street, going and returning on a Saturday night when most working people were off work on Sundays. And it is entirely probable that he would have stayed there until after midnight, giving him every opportunity to encounter Elizabeth Stride on Berners Street, murder her inside the gate of Dutsfield Yard and flee the scene after being disturbed, as we know to have been the case in that murder, and make his way back into his criminal range to satisfy his unsatisfied murderous impulses on Catherine Eddowes in Mitre Square. For sure, Berners Street to Mitre Square would take him away from his route home to Doveton Street, but we are not quite finished. Following the discovery of Catherine Eddowes' nightmarishly mutilated body in a dark corner of Mitre Square at 1:44 a.m, a piece of her apron soaked in blood, presumably hers but possibly also her killer's, was discovered by PC Alfred Long in the tenement doorway of 108 to 119 Golston Street, below the now infamous chalked Golston Street graffito, which we will return to no doubt in a later video. There can be no question this torn piece of fabric was discarded by Eddowes' killer. It was part of her apron. She had been savagely mutilated. It was covered in blood. No one else would have had it but her killer. This is what makes it such an important piece of evidence. The chalk graffito, not so much. Now the Ripper is heading home, and he is moving fast. Once again, London's most wanted man had shown his almost supernatural power to evade the police. Eddowes was discovered moments after her killer left the scene, and may have still been skulking in the shadows of Mitre Square when the ghoulish discovery was made. With the police presence stepped up to catch him, every available copper in the City of London and the Metropolitan Police Forces was out and after him, every nook and cranny of every street, as Golston Street demonstrates, was being scoured for evidence. Nowhere in Whitechapel was safe for him, and this time he would not have been in his work clothes. Not that that would have helped him much by this stage. The man responsible for the murders of Liz Stride and Kate Eddowes had to get home. No passing go, no collecting £200, just straight home. Without a single shadow of a doubt then, the piece of Eddowes' apron found on Golston Street tells us the killer's direction of travel to his home. So once again, we can plot out a line on the map. The line between Mitre Square and the doorway of Golston Street is moving north-east, following the trajectory of the line of Lechmere's journey to work. This line is moving eastward, parallel to the Whitechapel Road, in the direction of Doveton Street. It does not lead us back to St George in the east to support a marauder killer hypothesis there. No, this conforms perfectly to the proposed commuter model, emanating from somewhere north-east of Bucks Row, somewhere like Doveton Street. A quick check of the 1892 Ordnance Survey map of London gives us his most logical route. Leaving Mitre Square, either north-west or north-east through the narrow connecting lanes, brings him to Duke Street, then north-east along Stony Lane to New Golston Street, at the end of which is the junction with Golston Street, facing the very doorway of the Wentworth Model Dwellings tenement where the piece of apron was left. Now he has two options. Turn south to the Whitechapel High Street, which would by this point be the main thoroughfare for police responding to the alarm, or north to Wentworth Street, he's not going to go south. Wentworth Street will ferry him north-east in the direction we know he wants to travel from the trajectory of his journey so far, all the way to Old Montague Street and to Box Row. He is now absolutely moving along Charles Lechmere's route to work, moving directly towards the house where Lechmere lives on 22 Doveton Street. Where all of the evidence against Lechmere is, to be perfectly honest, circumstantial, there is a mountain of it. We can place him at every single crime scene at times when few others would be out and about. He is the only suspect who is actually at a crime scene in the official records and in highly suspicious circumstances. We know he lied to the police. He lied at the inquest. He gave a false name. Every murder happened at a place he was likely to be, and at a time he was likely to be there. The mathematical odds of this, as Holmgren points out, are astronomical. But for all the evidence, of which there is a ton, not a single piece of evidence gives him an alibi. But before tying up some loose ends, I would like to add my own analysis of an important piece of evidence which I think no one else has really examined. That of Robert Paul suspecting Mary Ann Nichols was still alive when he knelt down and touched her. On the left side of the neck, about an inch below the jaw, according to the post-mortem evidence given by Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn at the inquest into the death of Nichols on the 1st of September, there was an incision about 4 inches long and running from a point immediately below the ear, an inch below on the same side, and commencing about an inch in front of it was a circular incision terminating at a point about 3 inches below the right jaw. This incision completely severs all the tissues down to the vertebrae. The large vessels of the neck on both sides were severed. The incision is about 8 inches long. These cuts must have been caused with a long-bladed knife, moderately sharp and used with great violence. Owing to the lack of arterial spray and of blood generally pouring from the wound to her neck, it was Llewellyn's professional opinion that these cuts had been inflicted post-mortem, that is, after death, or we might imagine when her heart rate had been sufficiently slowed as a result of manual strangulation. This notwithstanding, such injuries to the throat would have, without strangulation, resulted in instantaneous death. In sum, this evidence informs us that when Robert Paul examined her, she was absolutely dead. Life was extinct. Yet this does not mean that the body was not incapable of movement. Llewellyn's evidence tells us that Nichols was all but decapitated, the blade having severed every tissue and vital artery all the way to the bone. Her head was attached only for the killer's inability to cut through the vertebra. Human beings are cephalocentric animals, meaning the brain is in control of all muscular and physiological movement. The moment the head is removed from the body, and for all intents and purposes Nichols' head had been removed, every regular and voluntary activity in the body ceases. It was then impossible that any stirring in the chest felt by Paul was breathing. However, when a human body is decapitated, the energy stored in the muscular structure of the body, which in vivo gives the body muscle tone, is released. It results in involuntary, spasmodic convulsions which will last for no more than a minute or two. While it is entirely possible Paul was mistaken, we must bear in mind that he was looking for signs of life. Now, it is certainly conceivable that he, not being aware of her near decapitation, mistook such an involuntary muscular tremor for Mary Ann Nichols breathing or attempting to breathe. If this analysis is correct then, given that he was on the scene for the last 8 minutes before Paul's arrival at Brown's stable yard on Box Row, Charles Lechmere must have been present at the scene at the time of Nichols' effective decapitation. There are a couple of loose ends in this presentation of the evidence. The question of Lechmere's use of the name Cross and the exact time of Annie Chapman's death. These are important details in the case against Charles Lechmere and have been used by the case for the defence to undermine the Lechmere hypothesis. In the next episode, which I promise will not be as long in the making, I have had rather demanding teaching commitments since the last video. We shall take a closer look at Lechmere's connection to the other Ripper murders, including that of Annie Chapman, and make an effort to untangle the Cross problem. Thank you for listening, for liking and subscribing, and for your kind and supportive comments. Stay safe, and I will see you next time.